All right. Welcome everybody to the final Tops and Tails Monday edition. It's a delight to see you this morning. We were just commenting before the recording got started that it's pretty astounding to think that we've reached the penultimate week of this semester and of this course, and we're already, I mean, we're talking about India and things like that, and we'll probably continue doing that today, but I know Rick and I are already up to our elbows thinking about the final chapter of Bellah and the last couple of discussion sessions where we'll be thinking about the entire course as a whole. But today, as is our wont, we are here for an hour to just hang out and talk about any issues related to the class, questions, thoughts, themes, pulling things together. Rick can even be drawn out about Motown. Yeah.
For those of you not who aren't present right now, that's because we were just talking about Motown prior to the recording starting. That didn't come completely out of the blue. It came out of my fantastic radio microphone. I'm very glad to be with you this evening.
There's not a ton of us here this morning, which is lovely. It means we can have a little bit more intimate of a discussion. We are recording it for people who aren't able to make this session. We have a Google Doc with some questions already geared up on it, I believe, Rick. I'm not sure. I
Yes, yeah,
I looked at those.
I think actually the first one, that's yours, Cindy, if I'm not mistaken, and we could look at that, right? Would you like to maybe just share it to begin with? All right, not to cut you off, Jake, if you had any more that you wanted to say.
Just one more sort of housekeeping thing. We've got the Google Doc with some questions on it that we'll be looking at as we go along, but also with a group of this size, feel free to unmute yourself and join the discussion. Ask a question spontaneously should you want to. We'll just keep going from there. It's also the chat box if you like that. But yeah, let's start with Cindy's question, which is on the Google Doc. And Cindy, did you want to lead us into that? I don't know.
Sure. I just want to make sure of my understanding, because when we first started Bellah, I think I got really excited that he was tapping into something mystical with his about remembering the past and the deep well that he quotes at the beginning of the book. And then as I've been reading through it, I've noticed that I can't find anything where he's saying that there's something outside of us that we can tap into. And instead, his big theme seems to be the acquisition of new capabilities. And that's what's driven evolution. And so and the other point that was confusing is, why did he include that whole thing about the cosmos at the beginning? I kept searching, like, he's so brilliant, he did it for a reason, and maybe I was not understanding why. So when I really went back and looked at everything again, I'm like, oh, he was just showing that we had capabilities that evolved, that we inherited, and those capabilities aren't lost. And then we build on those capabilities, which eventually went to culture. And some of those capabilities are great and some are not so great. So they're not, like, our culture is not the end all and something that's better than anything else. It's just an evolving of capabilies. And I was wondering, maybe there is a mystical aspect too that I was missing or I was misreading. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay. Great question. And you articulated it well in the written form, which is there some way that we could include that for people who happen to watch this later, Weston? Okay, great. So, So, Jake, I'm happy to take a first run at it, but
Sure.
if you, so I think you're, I've thought a lot about that question too, and I think a writer and a scholar like Bellah is basically addressing multiple audiences at once, and so he is keeping in mind a number of assumptions, premises, prejudices, and possible ways of bringing forth what he sees and what he believes in a way that will reach the audience that he wants to reach, which I think is basically the well-educated audiences of the early 21st century. And he therefore needs to, and he is a social scientist, so he is a scientist, and so he wants to have continuity with the other sciences. And I think also, this is my guess, I didn't talk to him about this, but his deep recognition and concern about the future, ecological and so forth, also fueled a certain recognition of how important it was to kind of recognize the role of the long natural history that preceded the human being, and that we are that our current and the impact that we are having now. My sense is that I don't know about the word mystical, which has, a number of possible meanings. I see him as being a deeply spiritual man, and I believe he does see a spiritual continuity from the beginning to the present. And capacities is the evolution of capacities, which you're exactly right, I think, to put your finger on that as being what he's drawing out as when he talks about nothing is lost. That very often is what he's talking about. I think you're right, and the idea of cultural of the different mimetic, mythic, and episodic cultures or cognitive modes, etc., capacities, the imaginative capacity that evolves in relationship to play, etc. All that is so critical for him to have a through line to his narrative. But I think he leaves it to us to draw on, to make connections that he is not explicitly drawing. And the connection that I in particular, after studying this book, helped catalyze my interest in biological evolution and evolutionary history. And I really have studied it pretty like daily for the last 12 years. And also to some extent cosmic history, and the history of the formation of the earth, the geological, etc. And it really even more than I mean, Bellah did I think a very good job of drawing out the continuities there, but the more I studied it, the more the continuities emerged. And I think if I think about that idea of the ultraviolet garden that insects have access to and that we are blind to, and I think about how, if that metaphorically, the ultraviolet garden can take a number of different forms, and the realities, and this is a term that Bellah uses, drawing on Schutz and Maslow and so forth, the realities that are enacted and elicited or opened up through our different capacities also involve spiritual and moral realities, and spiritual and moral ontologies emerge. And so my sense is that he's kind of asking us to recognize that there's something about our very scientifically grounded evolutionary foundations that have gone right through, cellular and animal, mammalian, primate, hominin, etc., to our own species and our own time and culture and post-axial status. In all those ways, the evolutionary process itself has brought forth capacities to be able to enact and discern extremely significant realities that open up way beyond the materialistic perspective. So I think he's kind of asking us to connect the dots in a way, in ways that, remember Jake was saying the other day, it's really important to not play your mystical card too soon. If you're making an argument, it's the last thing that you bring in, if you're going to bring it in. And at other times, very effective authors don't bring it in, but they leave all the clues there for the person who has eyes to see and ears to hear. So that's where I don't expect Bellah to give me all the answers, but I'm very grateful to him for him that he gave me a number of clues to the larger picture that I didn't have before I read this book. And even though I'd known Bellah's work and the earlier essay, but even more came out in the course of this book, as I hope everyone else feels as well, because it's been a big commitment to engage this book as deeply as we have. So those are my initial thoughts on it. How about you, Jake?
Yeah, I think I had a very similar question when I first read the book, Cindy. I got to the end and I thought, I felt like I'd read two books at first. The first couple chapters and some bits here and there felt to me like they were part of one book. And then a lot of what was going on in the case studies felt to me like they were part of a different book. And I didn't see the way that they integrated as fully. On subsequent readings, this is only my second time reading it all the way through, front to back, but I've gone back to individual parts of it again and again since first reading it. And I begin to see more the way that the elements introduced in those early chapters are developed and also foreshadow aspects of what he's doing in the individual cultures, right? So I think it's really important to Bellah to ground the emergence of both religion and of axiality in a narrative that goes all the way back in order to avoid the picture that there is a superstructure of detached culture that's transcendentally separated from everything that goes on before that, so that we continue to have this realm of culture, the humanities, history, etc., that obeys its own laws and is its own realm, utterly detached from the realm of rocks and physics and fundamental laws.
Turtles,
yeah, turtles. The strong and weak force and all that stuff, right? So I think part of the reason for that early grounding in not just mammalian evolutionary history, but of cosmic history, is because he wants to say not only that nothing is ever lost, but also that there are no ruptures that mean we're operating now in an entirely different world. We exist in this world that can develop and can produce new structures, new laws, but it doesn't separate us from what came before. And I think that dualism is one that's really at the heart of a lot of the modern academy. And so in one sense, Bellah's book is I think very explosive that way, in that it's trying to explode that dualism performatively even more than theoretically, because it's easy theoretically to say, I'm going to reject the vision of, the Kantian vision of the human being as a transcendental doublet with a body on the one hand and like this, you know, transcendental self floating above it on the other hand. You can say that easily enough, but to perform that in your scholarly work all the way through, I think that's part of what Bellah is trying to do with that large narrative. And I think that's also where the mystical element comes in. It's like Rick just said, I think Bellah is quite coy about the mystical aspect, or what I think he prefers to call the contemplative aspect. But he does hit that note in the beginning, recognizing it as a possibility and as something that he takes seriously as an event and as a part of human experience. If you want to call it a capacity, you can. I think that front loads it with too much of a judgment about what exactly is going on in contemplation. And I'm not sure that Bellah actually speaks of contemplation as of the contemplative event entirely as a capacity. It is something that we have, that we engage in, but whether that is entirely a capacity that we have possession of, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Bellah comes down directly on that. Maybe he does, and I have just elided it in my reading because I don't want to say that myself. But we could see. But then in the end, he comes back to it, and he does this really interesting thing when he comes back to it. It's the same thing that I said he was trying to do with the evolutionary arc. He takes contemplative capacities in this deep sort of contemplative, what we would essentially call mystical sense, right? Theoria, not just as rationality or ratiocination, but theoria as a contemplative capacity to behold the whole. This is something that comes really close to moksha, non-duality, centering prayer, vipassana meditation, all these kind of things that we can think of in different species. They all have this, they can fall under this generic description of the contemplative event. And what Bellah wants to do is he wants to connect that capacity to our focal powers of rationality and attention, saying they're different, right? They're different in kind. It's important to distinguish between doing math, doing logic, thinking about a complex problem, and this sort of pure contemplative awareness. But they're not, they can be distinguished, but they're not divisible from one another. They're both forms of the same luminosity that became newly reflexive in the axial periods that Bellah is looking for. And this is, if I were to go back and like ghostwrite part of the book with Bellah, this is the thing I think I would want to draw out more, is that in each of those cultures that he's looking at, you have simultaneous with the emergence of greater either rational or mythospeculative reflective powers. You also have the simultaneous emergence of a more centrally thematized, reflexive, meditative, contemplative, spiritually illuminative task, right? It gets put at the center of certain Confucian, Taoist, Hindu practices, but also you begin to get, this is the time period where you have the development and the proliferation of the mystery schools in Greece, and of Hebrew and then later Christian practices of meditation, right? Merkava type meditation, which is the ascent of the throne that lies in the background of what will eventually become Kabbalah and things like that. So you have, and that's that's a really interesting question, right? That's very cool. If we can think about mystical capacities emerging in tandem with greater thinking capacities, that's a different story about the origin of our extraordinary powers of thought that too often get told as a story of like the heroic kind of, the heroic rational individual freeing himself or herself from the mists of superstition and mysticism and things like that. And it's much more a story of both of these sides of the human capacity for consciousness, and it may be more than the human capacity for consciousness, emerging into greater reflexivity in both of its aspects, both its focal and its diffuse aspect, or what following following Alison Gopnik. Bellah calls in the final chapter flashlight and lantern consciousness, the flashlight focusing on the logical argument, the steps of the argument, the lantern opening out into a kind of non-dual oneness with the light itself.
And I think adding to that's so helpful, Jake. And I think adding to that, he actually does thematize that in his calling attention to the fact that the episodic mode of cognition has deep parallels with non-dual experience, with kind of contemplative, unitive kinds of experiences. And I think the fact, so that's another way in which nothing is ever lost, in which a capacity actually, which comes deep out of even pre-human and non-human sources, is related to mystical experiences, which as Jake was recalling for us, he really does. I mean, some of the most compelling examples that he gives right at the beginning of the book are quite explicitly mystical. Mm-hmm. And he clearly has a kind of attunement to them as well. When he's drawing on and quoting at length Václav Havel or some of the ancient mystical examples, also the one from of course Pascal, who he clearly identifies with in a very deep way as being both the scientist and the deeply spiritual or even mystical person, the fire imagery and so forth. So I think Bellah does give us clues, and at the same time as coy, as Jake said, and just also keep one last thing in mind, which I only gradually absorbed from Bellah in my conversations with him during the 90s. And that is one reason why he does not put the mystical and contemplative at kind of as his major explicit focus, is he is so interested in what are the consequences of our spiritual experiences and convictions on the playing field of life in the most pragmatic, practical ways, in terms of politics, ethics, society, how we treat each other, how we treat the earth, etc. So he always he wanted to know, to use a William James term, the cash value in a sense, or as Jake likes to say, how does that cash out in your, how does this mystical experience that you had, how is it cashing out in real life? How does it influence how you're treating other people, how we all live together fruitfully, etc. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that overall focus on the ethical and political and social. Cindy, do you have any?
No, those are great answers that I'll have to listen to again. And yeah, going back to what Jake said, I was really trying to, I saw like two lines of evolution, the biology going up, and at some point, because of play, I felt like that's why he brought in a lot of the play and the relaxed fields. We kind of were able to diverge, but it's still evolving on both levels, and it's still intertwined. So I think that is what he, was saying through our capabilities. But I was also, in relation to what Rick was saying, is that I think a big point of the book is too that not all of this is beneficial. Some of these adaptations are lost, obviously, and some were beneficial, but some of them, I mean, like what we're doing to the environment are really bad. And so we're really not going towards something better. I guess that's kind of what I got from it, that some of these capabilities help and some don't help. But just because you have them and you're evolving, it doesn't mean that you're better, basically. That's what I got.
Yeah, I think he's pretty explicit about that at a couple points in the book, where he's trying to say that he doesn't want to tell a story of he doesn't want to tell what the British would call a sort of Whiggish story of progress. That it's an evolving story, but he's trying hard not to attach, as far as I can see, value judgments to that evolution, and he tries this. I think you can see the way that he handles like the cases of like the Kalapalo or the Navajo or the early societies he looks at. I think he tries very hard to not fall into the trap that is so commonly modeled for us of looking at them nostalgically, but also with a kind of chronological snobbery or developmental snobbery. And I think Bellah's trying hard to not place these various societies he's looking at on a scale that's evaluating them as morally superior or inferior to one another. At least that's how I read him.
Yeah, he is so aware of this is a man whose life spanned most of the 20th century and early 21st, and he has no illusions about the horrors that humanity is capable of and has visited upon itself and upon the rest of the world. At the same time, he does say there are capacities that have evolved, which in a sense, like technologies or they're two-edged swords, and they have given us greater rational and even moral capacities and sensitivities, but they've also given us greater capacity for destructive use. And so it kind of gets back to something I think I said right at the end of one of our classes at the very beginning, and where we're talking about how the evolution of Homo sapiens has resulted in a being that on the one hand has developed extraordinary morally nuanced capacities, and at the same time these capacities that through cognitive and technological prowess are able to wreak havoc on the entire Earth community. And so basically we're in a situation in which now one species is in a position where the state of its moral development has absolute consequences for every species on the planet. And that's the dicey situation we're in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Christo, I'd love to hear what you have to say. And you also mentioned something in your chat that I wonder if you could say. When you said you had the question, his fellow student, faculty, colleagues at Harvard, what was that relating to?
Oh, when the discussion was going on, who was the audience that Bellah was writing to? I imagine that he was wanting to make a statement from his old alma mater coming out of Harvard.
I think even more after 40 years in Berkeley, he probably had. I mean, this is a person who was connected to scholars all around the world, Harvard and in Germany and England, et cetera. He was very international, but there's no question, and just as everything just as everything that we PCC faculty say and think about is to some extent shaped by what our colleagues and our conversations with our colleagues and what we've learned from them. I think it certainly had an influence on Bellah. Both his fellow faculty members in Berkeley and also his graduate students had a big role. In fact, he told me the biggest pleasure he had as a teacher, as a professor over the years has been supervising dissertations that he learned so much from.
Powerful. I have another question. I have a couple of biting questions if there's time for that.
Definitely.
The first one is, what role does Jesus of Nazareth play in the axial transformation? Could he be considered an axial prophet? And then the second question is there any philosopher who has gone deeply into describing the distinction between immanence and transcendence?
Lots on the latter, and well, I want to hand it over to Jake. It's his turn to talk a little bit, but yeah, these are great questions.
Yeah, the immanence and transcendence question is huge. One place you might want to start is in the response to Bellah's book, The Axial Age and Its Consequences. Actually, it's not even the response to Bellah's book. It was published around this. Was it published right before his book or right around the same time? You know what the volume I'm thinking of, Rick?
The Axial Age and Its Consequences,
Yeah.
I mean, is the anthology.
Yeah.
And I can't. Oh, you want to know when was it published? Was
it after Bellah's book or was it?
Yeah,
okay.
But it contains essays, many of which were given as papers in a conference in 2008, I believe it was, prior to the. So there's an interesting kind of chronological loop in there, so that like Charles Taylor is commenting, he's writing his paper on the axial, having read Bellah's or earlier religious evolution essay, and has gotten some sense. I think a lot of them had seen the later the 4 axial chapters. I think they were given those 4 axial chapters as part of the conference that happened in Germany, but then they hadn't seen the whole book, and maybe not everybody read all those chapters either. So there's a kind of some things. It came out after the book, after Religion and Human Evolution. It's edited by Bellah and Hans Joas, but it is it's based on many papers that were written prior to the publication of Religion and Human Evolution.
The reason why I bring it up is because for that volume, one of the they specially commissioned an essay on transcendence by the I think he's Swiss theologian Ingolf Dalforth. I think it's just called Transcendence or something like that. So, but it's written, the interesting thing about that, Dalforth isn't my favorite philosopher, theologian on these topics, but he does a fine job with it. And he does it in conversation with the axial thesis. So that's interesting if you're thinking about it in relationship to this class. As for my favorites, I think Charles Taylor is actually excellent on this. And he has a lovely chapter just called Transcendence in a volume called Transcendence, published by Regina Schwartz, Schwarz. And that's a great chapter. But my absolute favorite philosopher on this, living, if we do people from the past, then this would go on too long. But my favorite living philosopher thinking about transcendence is the Irish philosopher William Desmond, who I think is just fantastic at this.
Yeah, you unpacked his several definitions of transcendence. That was very interesting.
And he develops it he has a whole metaphysics basically that thinks alongside those things. A metaphysics that he calls of the between, or a metaxology. But it's really great. He's a fantastic philosopher who's in deep dialogue with deeply started as a Hegel scholar, but always in deep dialogue with the continental traditions of hermeneutics and people like Richard Kearney and Jack Caputo and Derrida and all those folks. But he remains a metaphysician through it all, and is thinking about transcendence, and is open to, he's Irish, so he's got this deep sort of poetic sense as like that's always cultivated in that sort of like Irish literary tradition. So it's really wonderful.
What would Desmond, was there a particular book that you singled out?
So, I mean, if you wanted to get his explicit reflections on transcendence, you'll find those most fully developed in God and the Between, which is the third in a trilogy he wrote that begins with Being in the Between, that's on metaphysics, Ethics in the Between, that develops in ethics of this, and then God in the Between, that thinks about the sort of philosophy of religion and theology of it. But yeah, so one place though that you might want to start instead with some essays. I'll try to upload some of them actually to the website. I think I'll teach some of them next semester in my metaphysics after modernity course, but a lot of his really great essays treat this in a shorter amount of time than those big books do. And you can find a lot of those collected in the volume, The Intimate Strangeness of Being.
Okay, thank you. So do you think immanence is already implied with transcendence?
You can think about transcendence in two different ways. I think of it as akin to what Hegel was trying to do with the distinction between the real infinite and the bad infinite. So you can have transcendence imagined in what Heidegger would call like an ontotheological way. And an ontotheological view of transcendence is going to see the divine as the tippy top of a pyramid. So it's, and that kind of transcendence is, I think, opposed to immanence in one sense, even though it's too immanent in another sense. So it's opposed to immanence in one sense because with the divine imagined as the tippy top of the pyramid, essentially an archaic model of divinity, right? You have an unbridgeable gulf that is always going to be oppressive to that below it, right? Because the transcendent then is, because it's conceived as the summit of an infinite hierarchy, I will never reach that summit. No matter how many steps I take, I'm infinitely distant from it. This is the kind of thing I think Nietzsche really radically lampoons and helps us to feel what that kind of transcendence is like when Nietzsche talks about like, if there were a God looking down on us this way, how could I bear not to be that God sort of thing. It's like, it's just this infinite gaze that is in competition with us because it exists in a hierarchy that begins down here and leads all the way there. On the other hand, and that would be like Hegel's bad infinite, the serially infinite, right? The infinite set of even numbers, right? Never comes to an end, no matter how far I go along. Even when I get to, 2 billion googolplex, whatever, I'm still infinitely away from the end of that. Whereas I think the axial, the axial age at its most sublime also articulates is a vision of transcendence that's not in competition with immanence, because the transcendent is not imagined as any part of the furniture of the universe. It's not the top of a pyramid. It's not the summit of a scale of being. It is being itself, from which all beings and all scales and everything else hangs. Everything else is suspended by being itself. And so being itself isn't a being in the midst of all other beings that could then be the summit that I can never cross. And so because of that, it's simultaneously, as Augustine puts it, superior super meo, or no, superior super meo at intima, interior intimo meo. It's both higher than the highest above me, because it's outside of the entire realm of scales of being, and more intimate than anything could ever be inside me, because everything that exists within the realm of being, there's a sense in which I always can never quite coincide with it. I'm in, to one extent, a quasi-competitive relationship with all other beings, because to the extent that they're a being and I'm a being, there's a distinction there. But in one sense, and this is what, you get all these sort of axial mystics realizing, someone like Nicholas of Cusa articulates this by saying, God is so other, so aliud, that God is non-aliud, non-other, because otherness, omne definitio est negatio, every definition is a kind of negation, but there is no negation within the divine. There is no negation within the transcendent, truly imagined as transcendent, the absolute as fully absolute. So in that sense, you get that's where you sort of launch from thinking about hierarchies of being and things like that, and you get slingshotted into non-duality and all of these great sort of mystical traditions. And so I think it's always important so for me, that the shorthand I use is I describe true transcendence as the superlative form of immanence. That is, it's immanence taken to its superlative mode of being. It's no longer just what is, but you have to go through that process of saying, it's not this, right? It's neti, it's neither this nor that. It's not this thing, it's not this thing. And then you say it's all these things. You say it's none of these things, and then you slingshot into the superlative mode, where you're no longer using language in the way you would ordinarily use language, but are instead gesturing towards this realization or illumination that can be spoken about, but can't be captured in language, and yet seems to energize all of these insights that issue from it, right? It seems to energize our thinking, energize our language, energize our culture building, and so forth. And that, is what I would describe as the realm of the really mystical or the truly transcendent.
That's great,
Wow.
Jake. Thanks for doing that. And then people who are listening to this, who are interested in, of course, the whole participatory perspective that Jake has helped bring into the scholarly conversation is one that participate, like basically the mutual participation of immanent and transcendent is a crucial idea. Also, this relates to that theological perspective called panentheism, and so which is different than pantheism. It's different than it's a form of theism, I think, strictly speaking, but it's a particular form of it that's quite different from the basically, as Jake was saying, kind of neo-archaic or archaic backdrop of a transcendent that is oppressively at the top of the pyramid, over and separate from the immanent world. People who are interested in it from even within the medieval Christian context, there's a Thomas Aquinas, there's an interpretation of Aquinas that I'm sure Jake knows quite well. Mary Clark did a great anthology of Aquinas's writings, in which she makes the point that the essential Aquinas is existential. And again, it's a participatory view of what Jake was talking about. It's not God not as a separate being, but God as being, capital B. So those are a couple of thoughts. Christo, you had another
Sure.
earlier question that you said, and you'll just have to articulate it again, because we got into the transcendent immanent.
Right. Well, that could go on for a whole couple degrees, right? But I'm wondering about whether the role of Jesus of Nazareth could be considered a axial prophet role, coming out of the tradition of the Hebrew prophets that Bellah describes.
Absolutely. And of course, how we view Jesus shapes the religious perspectives of enormous sections of humanity, and creates all sorts of controversies and so forth. But certainly Jesus was a great Jewish prophet of the that reflects the axial turn. And in my reading of it, when you also include, the larger Christian phenomenon at the beginning from, that would include Paul and the Gospel of John, all the New Testament, but going right up through, let's say Augustine and some of the Greek fathers, you have a perspective that I think brings about a major mutation within the axial. That's how I would regard it. It in some ways, among the axial traditions, the lineage that Jesus is such a key figure in, or perhaps the key figure, is the one that particularly affirms the value of the, not only the immanent, but the individual, and of matter, the material world, and of history. This is not necessarily carried in all the different Christian sects that have emerged and become even dominant at different times, which can become quite dualistic, quite archaic in the pyramid sense, all sorts of things, quite guilt trippy, whatever, all sorts of things can come in there. But yeah, if anybody wants to see the absolute shadow of Christianity and the Catholic Church in Ireland in particular, there's a new book out by gosh, I can't believe I'm blocking his name. James Wood did a great review of it in the New Yorker 2 weeks ago. Jake, remind me, it's the Irish writer, political writer, who has been writing for the New York Review of Books. Great. Anyway, it'll come to my mind, or I'll look it up while we're talking about other things. But it's a fantastic. I mean, I'll put the because it's such a powerful rendering of the shadow side of Christianity, which is this other deep reality of really of all the axial traditions, but Christianity certainly has its intensive share. It's worth holding that in tension with the nobility and particular glory of the Christian mystery that has been carried and unpacked. And it does, in my mind, bring absolutely crucial interventions within the axial transformation that I can't think of the axial without including.
Yeah. I'm not sure which you were what you were thinking of, the James Wood review, but there is there's definitely a kind of monstrous series of reports coming out of Ireland.
Fintan O'Toole, that's the name of
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
A personal history, or we don't know ourselves, a personal history of modern Ireland.
Yeah. It's quite, but if you want to get the short version, which Robert's almost through the 400 pages or however long it is, or he's 400 pages through the book, but he said the review, which I've read, powerful James Wood article in the New Yorker. I'll put that on the chat list in a second. That conveys faithfully the whole thing, which and quite with plenty of feeling as well as insight.
On Christo's question about Jesus, I think for me, one of the interesting things is not only how the figure of Jesus can fit into an axial story, but actually how paying attention to Bellah's account of the axial story, I think, gives real insight into some of the depths of what's going on in the Gospels tradition and the depictions of Jesus. In particular, I'm always struck by how it's only if you understand the role that archaic kingship plays in holding together and legitimating an entire society, both a hierarchical and a religious mode of expression, that the subversion of that image of the king in the figure of Jesus and the story that gets told about him, right? The fact that you have this teacher who is hailed as a king and yet constantly refuses any of the privileges associated with kingship, and ends crucified, right? And there's that famous those famous lines from, I think it's the Gospel of Matthew that includes this. I might be confusing it, where some of the soldiers put up a sign on the crucifixion that says, "This is the King of the Jews," and some of the people in attendance say, "No, put up a sign that says, 'He said, I am the King of the Jews.'" And the reply is, "What I've written, I've written." They just leave it up like that. Well, this powerful image of a subversion of kingship, right? In the way that story is told, the soldiers, in the one sense, are mocking a people that they're colonizing, and yet, in another sense, in the way that the Gospels tell the story, that's the subversion of kingship. This is what good kingship looks like. The one who gives his life for the sake of others and doesn't lord it over others, and by doing so radically distributes dignity and radically undoes what René Girard calls the sacrifice, the scapegoat mechanism that attends to archaic sacrifice, whereby we collectively vent our common feeling, our collective effervescence in an act of violence upon a common victim whose innocence has to be hidden so that we can feel ourselves to be innocent. And here it's all undone. The innocence of the victim is displayed, and all the brutal mechanisms of power that subtend empire get shown to be what they are, as kingship gets subverted, and a true kingship that is no longer lordly, but is the radical distribution of dignity is realized. That's an axial perspective. And that's, in a sense, what you can see part of the force of the Jesus story doing. And yet it's kind of hidden from us if we don't understand all these sociological aspects of pre-axiality and archaic kingship and things like that Bellah helps us to understand. So yeah, I think it fits in very much. And I think Bellah has it in the back of his mind too, while he's writing. I don't think it's just that I picked that up. I think Bellah has some of that present in his thinking.
Yeah. And you can see, I mean, he's quite skillful in showing us the king theme running through all the major axial societies, but in a new form, axial form. But by not bringing out the Christian, he's given us still the clues to see it, not only in the subversion of kingship in like clearly set out in the way that the Roman soldiers presented there, but also in the fact the crucifixion happens on a mountain, on Mount Golgotha. Now the mountain, the temple, the pyramid, the ziggurat, Mount Olympus, Mount Zion, these are all archaic, reaching out from the immanent to the transcendent, right? To the, from the earthly to the celestial. And but at the top of this mountain, instead of there being this triumphant embodiment of human triumph, or tautological, but of achievement, there's a crucifixion, there's a dying in the most demeaning way, and lost, absorbed, even by the biblical narrative, who says, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" at a crucial point, so that even this king has lost the sense of the connection in the completing of the divine's immersion into the human, and as Jake said, in that act, there is a radical distribution of spiritual dignity, of divinity to the whole in a new mode. It's an incredible inversion, because so you put the cross. That's why the cross is such a powerful symbol. You put the cross at the top of the pyramid, where before there had been the pharaoh, in a very secularly powerful way. I'm going to just finish by reading this incredible, wonderful. Some of you may have seen it, but Annie Lamont, she's a novelist from the Bay Area, very fine one, and she's just turning 68, and she wrote this and said, "God, what a world. What a heartbreaking, terrifying freak show. It is completely ruining my birthday plans. I was going to celebrate how age and the grace of myopia have given me the perspective that almost everything sorts itself out in the end, that goodwill and decency and charity and love always eventually conspire to bring light into the darkest corners, that the crucifixion looked like a big win for the Romans." Then she goes on, but turning 68 means you weren't born yesterday. And then she lists all the things that she's seen in her lifetime, and that sort of, but what a perfect kind of, I don't know, novelistic way in a single sentence of saying what we've just been talking about, that the crucifixion looked like a big win for the Romans. That's the inversion, the radical axial inversion of the archaic pyramid.
Jake, your answer was so poetic, I'm suspecting you might have Irish heritage.
I do. My Irish grandmothers will be extremely happy to hear you said that. So do we have anything else up for people?
There's something else from Megan that was posted for today, if I'm not mistaken, but let's see.
There's a comment for you, Rick, in the last paragraph, and there's another comment for
Aaron. Yeah.
Aaron, and I included it just in the event that maybe either of you had, something to offer on it. But
so we could go to that unless somebody else who's present would like to share. Emily, did you have something?
I think Emily was just
Emily's saying goodbye. It's just,
it's either call on me or see ya.
Yeah, right. It was too late. I didn't get her.
No, I think she was available until the hour.
Yeah. Well, I could just read what she. Shall I, Jake, read what Megan said or not?
Yeah, I mean, Megan raised a question about the horse sacrifice, I believe, for Aaron, which I won't really be able to speak to. I found the horse sacrifice, it's intensely intriguing and interesting, but I don't have the specialist knowledge to dig into her question.
Right. And then the comment to me, well, I'll just read it because it basically gives some more information that others of us might appreciate. So she said, this is Megan, on another note, I think the hyper-orality that Rick was asking about, I asked Aaron after his talk, that this hyper-orality was used also in verifying Islamic hadith, the stories and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. It is interesting to see how well received the method is today, even among, say, engineers in Istanbul. People I've discussed this with view it as nearly a science. Something of this nature can also be found at Irish traditional music sessions, when musicians will give a long list of names of those who had a part of playing certain tunes before and who might have introduced a particular element of change. Songs have lineages. Yeah, that's great. Very, very helpful. I do that sometimes when I'm lecturing about like the song the great work Little Wing that Jimi Hendrix did originally, and then an incredible version was done by Stevie Ray Vaughan that just changed the playing field entirely. And then Eric Clapton and, well, actually even before that, Eric Clapton and Duane Allman did a dual version of it. And then Stevie Ray Vaughan did his version. And then finally, Steve Kimmock, about 20 years ago, synthesized them all in an incredible way. And so it's so interesting. I think all of Jewish, the Jewish religion thrives on that kind of tracking of the interpretations of the Hebrew Bible, for example, and different scholars and rabbis commenting on what other rabbis have said, and it's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's great. The oral tradition survives a lot longer than we often acknowledge. One of the things I like about the way that Bellah puts this is he's clear that literacy doesn't immediately displace orality, and I often will make the argument when looking at things like up through the High Middle Ages that these are intensely literate cultures, but their literacy is basically it's like an oral kind of literacy, right? They still read with their voice, and there's a kind of juxtaposition of oral culture and literary culture in the very way they approach the book. It's different than the way we approach the book. There's a kind of movement into a different mode of literacy that's more detached from orality and the body. Once you move from books that are heavy and material and hard to produce and expensive and things like that, and that you have to read with your tongue, to books that are now text, that exists as text, separated from the page, sort of abstracted into this realm of information, more than the realm of performance, right? Like a book. Those of you who have taken my classes in the past have probably heard me say something like, a medieval book is it's like a record to be played with the needle of the tongue. It's not just a text. It's a thing that gets vocalized, that becomes sonorous, and only by becoming sonorous becomes part of the world, becomes part of you, becomes part of the culture that it helps to build. Well, that's something different than just pure orality. And in those periods also, you still have the preservation of the capacity for oral traditions of memory and things like that. There's the arts of memory are still present and active, and not everything is written down, even for us, arguably, but certainly for most people before us.
And if we think about even in our lifetimes, well, or some of our lifetimes, what was one of the most influential words with ideas and image contained in them that had a powerful effect on the entire cultural ethos for decades afterwards. It wasn't necessarily a book. I mean, you think about Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. It's a speech entirely oral. He draws on words that are coming from like Amos and the Bible and so forth, but it's an oral statement that, because it was oral and rather than written out, had way more influence because it's performed I mean, he's the entire tradition of sermon giving, particularly in the African American church, is contained in his rhetoric and his way of speaking. You just look at his body, how he's pulling up feeling from his own depths, but those depths are reaching out to the 100,000 people that are out in the crowd in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and he's drawing on all of that, and they're part of the participatory oral event as well. It's a lot of the power of it. Even the fact that Mahalia Jackson is sitting behind him And at a certain point, while she's talking about, he is talking about checks that are bouncing in the dishonorable treatment of blacks by the U.S. society, the American society. She reminds them, tell them your dream, from the back. I mean, it's a participatory event by tell them your dream, Martin. And then he pulls on, because she knew of how he had shared this on other occasions. And so it was an oral event, and that had, even in our hyper literate culture, the oral event is drawing on depths of the mimetic and somatic and ethical reserves that written and read texts can't quite approach still to this day.
Yeah, that's great. All right.
Chad.
Yeah, actually, that feeds right into what I was going to bring up. And would you say, in that sense, that like the power of his speech at that moment, with the potency of the content, in a sense, became like an external memory system, like in the sense that, like, where they're pointing towards, Bellah's pointing towards, writing, or I guess it's Merlin Donnell, that like how important external memory systems were for the development of our cognition, and that like even something like that, even though it's oral, the power of it becomes so it kind of instantiated in the mind that it serves as something like what the written word had done.
I think I just add to that, the power makes it powerful, but the external memory comes in with the fact that it was recorded and has been played over and over again, audio, video, etc. And that is more directly the kind of external memory that I think that Merlin Donald is referring to.
Right. Okay. So what I want to say, it's bear with me. I'm gonna read two passages really quickly, and it harkens back to something Jake said in 2006 at the book reading for Cosmos and Psyche, which was, I'm paraphrasing, I haven't heard it since then, but you said something like in your comments after reading it at the end of the session that you felt as though Cosmos and Psyche had returned the questions to us in a certain way. I'm remembering like that we could ask certain, maybe the great questions in a new way to philosophy, applying it, And so what I'm thinking here is that, is it possible that archetypal astrology can play a part in a second axial awakening? And specifically in the sense of like where Bellah points out that Mogliano points to criticism, and Eisenstadt to reflexivity, and Elkanah to second order thinking, that like the archetypal astrology creates the possibility for a type of third order awareness where we're thinking with the cosmos, we're thinking with the archetypes in a way that is applying our second order reflexivity to what is actually informing part of our thought process. And when I mentioned the external memory thing, this is from Merlin Donnell. He says, external memory is a critical feature of modern human cognition. If we are trying to build an evolutionary bridge from Neolithic to modern cognitive capabilities, or a structural bridge from mythic to theoretic culture, the brain may not have changed recently in genetic makeup, but its link to accumulating external memory networks affords it cognitive powers that would not have been possible in isolation. This is more than a metaphor. Each time the brain carries out an operation in concert with external symbolic storage system, it becomes part of a network, its memory structure is temporarily altered and the locus of cognitive control changes. And I think what Rick's work in Cosmos and Psyche does, in a sense, or can do, is provide an external memory system for our understanding of history, that we're not just thinking about history and like through written word or through our philosophy, but that there's an external referent frame that allows us to not only understand history, but I mean, on some level, what I think astrology does is that, like you were pointing towards the 15th century, or someone asked the question, you know, does the Copernican revolution, the modern era, constitute a second axial awakening? And in a sense, yes, it does. The changing of the gods, the theory, you know, the changing of our critical framework. But in a sense, like where the axial differentiated the mundane and the transcendent, the modern kind of like, it calls into question both. And we end up with the secular age, and that where archetypal astrology, in a sense, the same way that that the Copernican revolution saved the appearances of the wandering motions of the planets, doesn't archetypal astrology have the capacity to save the phenomena that the modern era has called into question, both cosmic and mundane? And I was going to read, you know, this second passage from Bellah, where he quotes Mongliano, and it's just describing how the second order thinking that Elkanah is bringing up is not just applied to geometric proof. I'm on page 275. He says, new models of reality, either mystically or prophetically or rationally apprehended, are propounded as criticism of an alternative to the prevailing models. That's from Elkanah. And he says, we have not theories about limited realms of reality, not second order thinking about a limited area of reality such as geometric proof, but a second order thinking about cosmology, which for society is just emerging from the archaic. And I think we could say here from the modern or the postmodern, meant thinking about religio-political premises of society itself. It is second order thinking in this central area of culture previously filled by myth that gave rise to the idea of transcendence, so often associated with the Axial Age. And then he quotes Elkanah again. Transcendental breakthrough occurred when, in the wake of second order weighing or clashing alternatives, there followed an almost unbearable tension threatening to break up the fabric of society, and the resolution of the tension was found by creating a transcendental realm. And I would put creating in, I mean, that's true for then, but what archetypal astrology does, it's not creating a transcendental realm, it's revealing it. And then he goes on to say that, you know,
Chad, maybe
yeah, please.
I think people have, since we have read that, yeah, it's a great passage. And I think what if I could just, first of all, I'm amazed that you remember something from 15 years ago that Jake said.
It had a powerful effect on me.
In Namaste Hall that evening when we, at the time of the launch of Cosmos and Psyche. But yeah, I mean, the saving the, that is, when I brought up saving the phenomena or saving the appearances that Plato was wanting to do with respect to the problem of the planets, I definitely had in mind saving the phenomena from materialism, basically, and from nihilism. Yeah, I actually see the Copernican revolution as still unfolding, and I see the Copernican revolution as a continual unfolding of the axial, and it's still unfolding. Hubble's work and Brian's work and Thomas Berry, those are all part of a larger. It's a constant recontextualization and out-contextualization of what has preceded, so that we see everything from a new perspective. And at a certain point, we start to reconnect with that which we've dissociated from. And in some sense, that's what the participatory form of transcendence that Jake was spelling out is so relevant. The last thing I'll say is Bellah is bringing in Elkanah's. He said, remember that Elkanah is an historian of science,
Right.
and he counters Elkanah by saying it's not just that it's that, like, the idea that it was this tension between what was rationally apprehended and what is, or this tension between multiple perspectives or paradigms that forces us to create another reality. Now, Bellah says you can't just do that. It's when we're talking about these religious things, it's more than just a kind of theoretical construct. Now, he gets around it, Bellah does, by rooting it back in. There has to be a narrative dimension to it. I think that's as close as he gets to saying there has to be a participatory disclosure, and not just a theoretical construction that solves the tension of opposites that was so intolerable. And so, while I appreciated Bellah saying, well, I don't think that Elkanah's his historian of science perspective is quite adequate for doing justice to the axial transformation, I think he could have gone further. Bellah could have gone further, and that's what I actually, both Jake and I have been emphasizing throughout the course, is that these going back to that early chapter that has the title "The Making of Meaning." Making of meaning can sound a little bit like construction, and there's more of an element of disclosure and revelation, but it's always of a participatory kind. It's not just, you can't just do an end run around your interpretive frameworks and traditions. It's actually being enacted through them and through our own subjectivity.
Yeah, exactly. That's the next sentence, is that what you mentioned, that he about the historian of science idea. And I think what I was going to add to that, or ask, this is the question really, is rather than creating a transcendental realm or constructing meaning, and then he says, because the transcendental realms are not subject to disproof the way scientific theories are. And I think that's where astrology has a little bit of a different contextualization, in the sense that it's the mathematical structure of the solar system, and it's an empirical reality that we use as a reference frame for discernment of external memory, as I was saying before, but also it requires narrative and imaginative cognition, and it incorporates all the modes: episodic, emetic, theoretic. But does it also contain not only a new myth, a new narrative, but grounded potentially in a scientific or a new form of science on some level?
Yeah, I think it is one of those forms that have been emerging in recent years, or re-emerging, that help transcend that polarity, that dualism, and in a way is one of the forms of final participation that Barfield discusses.
Mm-hmm.
I'm conscious of the fact that many people in this course may not be as conversant with or as engaged by archetypal astrology as you are, Chad. And although I know some of us here in this group present right now are, but I we could talk about this at length at other times, because, you know, you're obviously picking up on a lot of things that were pregnant in Cosmos and Psyche, that, like, I was being not as coy as Bellah was, but a little bit in that direction. Yeah. I
Right.
mean, you have to speak as a Greek to the Greeks, as long as you are speaking to the Greeks. Okay. But thanks for
Thank you.
those insights.
And thanks everybody for joining us today. It's been a treat. I think we're at the end of our time here.
Very
Yeah.
close to it. Yeah, I've added the PDF, the James Wood article from the New Yorker that Rick mentioned previously as a PDF. I've included the PDF in the chat here. It'll also be loaded to Canvas for anyone watching this and wants to see that.
Right. Yeah, I just put the link up there, but the PDF is even better. I mean, it's intense. The shadow of Irish Catholicism. I think of Ireland as having this kind of powerful bivalence in terms of its heritage, and there is this kind of poetic, mystical, Celtic mysticism, and the Irish literary tradition, the capacity for a kind of very imminent spiritual vision that is poetically expressed within the Irish sensibility. And then there's this other, and also there's many noble things about Irish Christianity and Catholicism that runs through the last 1500 years, or however long it's been. But the things that are discussed in that article and in Fintan O'Toole's book, and Fintan O'Toole is, I think, Robert and Brian's favorite current author writing on political, social matters right now. He writes for the New York Review of Books very frequently, and he's quite a compelling sensibility and writer. So it's worth reading.
I'd buckle up.
Sharing it.
Yeah. Great. I think that's it. Is that all right?
Thank you all for joining us today. And yeah, it's the end of our Monday morning crack of dawn events, and we have 2 more classes from on Wednesdays at the much more civilized hour of 4:30 to 7:30 here in the Pacific Coast.
And Tops and Tails will continue on Mondays through to the last class, the week of the last class, just for anyone watching. And I'm going to be emailing with Aaron. Aaron was really keen on that, so maybe he'll join next Monday's Tops and Tails, just as a, to fill in some blanks, and maybe Megan can join us, and we'll see.
That would be great.
That would be.
All right. Cheers, everyone.